This is the Laowa 8-16mm f3.5-f16 ultra-wide zoom for APS-C cameras. It comes in a variety of different mounts. The cost is about $550. And if you do a lot of landscape photography or architecture photography or real estate videos, then this might be a great lens for you, especially if you're using Sony APS-C or other APS-C cameras. But there are a few things you need to be aware of before you decide if this lens is for you. Now, in full disclosure, Laowa lent this to me for a couple of weeks. No money changed hands, and they don't get to see this video before it's launched. One of the best things about this lens is the focal length. You get 8-16mm for APS-C, which essentially means about 12-24mm, so you're in that super ultra wide focal length, which is great for real estate, great for landscapes, and just in general, anything you want to get super ultra wide with. But it also boasts a really close focus range, which means you can get really close to subjects and get an almost macro-like shot, but still have a fair amount of the surrounding area included in your shot. Now, it is very small and pretty lightweight. Comes in at just under 500 grams, which is great. And while there are no front filter threads on this, it does come with a hood that allows you to attach 86mm filters. However, you're really only gonna be able to attach one, and you're definitely gonna want to use the thinnest one possible to avoid extra vignetting. From there, we've got just a little bit over a 1/4 degree turn for the focus. We've got 8-16mm, and then we've got a 3.5-16mm aperture, which can be clicked or declicked. So personally, I generally use clicked because I like to kind of lock it in place. All the rings feel pretty good. They're well dampened, although they're very close together because of the size of this lens, and so I find myself constantly bumping kind of both as I'm trying to change. The zoom ring is the most stiff, and it is an internal zooming, so it doesn't change the length of the lens or the weight of the lens, which would make this lens very good for gimbal use. Which leads me into who is this lens for? Really, if you're shooting APS-C from Sony, Canon, Fujifilm, Nikon, anything like that, then this lens is gonna be great for you if you wanna get those really ultra wide landscape shots or architecture shots because the lens has very low distortion. For landscapes, the use is pretty obvious. You get very wide, fairly distortion-free images that look great and gives you a huge field of view and a pretty good zoom range going from 8-16, which means you can compose a lot of different shots very creatively and get some really interesting looks. But I think one of the primary uses of this lens would be for architecture. And while I didn't have a chance to test this very much on architecture, I did test it just here in the studio against this background, and like a lot of Laowa lenses, it gives you a very low distortion image, which means there's no bowing on the sides or the top, so it doesn't skew your straight lines, which is extremely important when you're doing any sort of architecture photography or videography, especially in real estate work. Now, because it's so ultra wide and because it has such low distortion, it can give you a great effect of making small spaces appear much larger than they actually are, which is extremely useful if you do a lot of real estate or architectural work. Image quality wise, the lens does pretty well, actually the best at 8mm. But wide open at f3.5, the center's decently sharp, whereas the corners are a little bit soft. But if you stop down to f8, then everything sharpens up pretty nicely. Now at f16, the story is very similar, but the corners are even a little bit softer when the lens is wide open at f3.5. But again, if you stop down to f8, then everything sharpens up really nicely. Now this is a manual focus lens, and there are no electronics to give you any sort of data to your camera to be able to record into like Lightroom or anything like that. But because it's so ultra wide, it's not too difficult to get focus set exactly where you need to. And if you stop it down between f4 and f5.6, you basically are gonna have a pretty hard time missing focus completely. There are a few things you need to be aware of. One is the fact there is no weather sealing on this lens. So if you do landscape stuff, that could be an issue, especially if you're like me and you operate out in cold and harsh environments. For real estate or for architecture, that's not gonna be such a big deal because you're operating in controlled environments. Another downside of this lens is the fact that it only goes to f3.5, and you're shooting on APS-C, which means you already have a little bit more limited amount of light that comes into the sensor just because the sensor is a smaller sensor. So starting at f3.5 makes it a little bit more of an issue when you're shooting in low light environments. That being said, most modern cameras operate pretty well at higher ISOs, but just be aware, this is not a low light lens. But overall, for the price, this is an excellent ultra-wide lens for anybody who films or takes photos with APS-C. And especially if you do real estate work or architecture work where you don't have to worry so much about your shutter speeds when you're doing photos. There are, of course, affiliate links down in the description where you can check this lens out or buy it in more detail if this fits your bill. And if you got any value out of this video or if you enjoyed it, then consider subscribing to this channel. I've got lots more content like this coming and also posted in the past. In the meantime, you're gonna wanna check this video out here for some of the best budget lenses for Sony cameras. I'll see you over there. As always, if you have questions, ask me in the comments below or join my live stream, which happens most Wednesday nights at 4 p.m. Alaska time, 8 p.m. Eastern. I'll see you again soon in the next video. Cheers.